This session is dedicated to those who believe their inner dialogues and emotions must be projected onto others and their lives, and that projection constitutes reality. It doesn't. It never has. It never will. Hello and welcome to Read Poorly by Tom the SCAPEGOAT. I am your host, Tom the SCAPEGOAT, and today we'll be reading very poorly the New York Times bestseller, Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations by Ronen Bergman. Let's jump in. A note on the sources. The Israeli intelligence community guards its secrets jealously. Its near-total opacity is protected by a complex array of laws and protocols, strict military censorship, and the intimidation, interrogation, and prosecution of journalists and their sources, as well as a natural solidarity and loyalty among the espionage agency's personnel. All glimpses behind the scenes have, to this day, been partial at best. How then, it might reasonably be asked, would one write a book about one of the most secretive organizations on earth? Efforts to persuade the Israeli defense establishment to cooperate with the research for this project went nowhere. Requests to the intelligence community that it comply with the law by transferring its historical documents to the state archive and allowing publication of materials 50 years old or more were met with stony silence. A petition to the Supreme Court for an order forcing compliance with the law was dragged out over years with the complicity of the court and ended with nothing but an amendment to the law itself. The secrecy provisions were extended from 50 years to 70 years, longer than the history of the state. The defense establishment did not merely sit with folded arms. As early as 2010, before the contract for this book was even signed, a special meeting was held in the Mossad's Operations Division, Caesarea, to discuss ways of disrupting my research. Letters were written to all former Mossad employees, warning them against giving interviews, and individual conversations were held with certain ex-staffers who were considered the most problematic. Later, in 2011, the chief of the General Staff of the IDF, Lieutenant General Gabi Ashkenazi, asked the Shin Bet to take aggressive steps against the author, claiming that I had perpetrated aggravated espionage by having in my possession classified secrets and, in quotes, using classified material in order to disparage me, Ashkenazi, personally, end quotes. Since then, several actions have been taken by various bodies to stop publication of the book, or at least large parts of it. The military censor requires that Israeli media to add the words, in quotations, according to foreign publications, exit quotations, whenever it mentions secret actions attributed to Israeli intelligence, primarily targeted assassinations. This is to make it clear that the existence of the publication does not constitute official knowledge of Israel's responsibility. In this sense, then, the book must be taken as a foreign publication, whose contents do not have any official Israeli confirmation. None of the thousands interviews upon which this book is based, with sources ranging from political leaders and chiefs of intelligence agencies to the operatives themselves, were approved of by Israel's defense establishment. Most of the sources are identified by their names. Others, understandably, feared being identified and are therefore referred to by their initials or nicknames. In addition to any details about them I was able to provide while still keeping their identities secret. I have also made use of thousands of documents given to me by these sources, all of which are referenced for the first time here. My sources never received permission to remove these documents from their places of employment, and certainly did not have permission to pass them on to me. This book is thus about as far as possible from an authorized history of Israeli intelligence read poorly. So why did these speakers speak to me and supply me with these documents? each had his own motive, and sometimes the story behind the scenes is only a little less interesting than the content of the interview itself. It is clear that some politicians and intelligence personnel, two professions highly skilled in manipulation and deception, were trying to use me as a conduit for their preferred versions of events, or to shape history to suit themselves. I've tried to thwart such attempts by cross-checking with as many written and oral sources as I could, but it seemed to me that there was often another motive, which had much to do with a particularly Israeli contradiction. On the one hand, nearly everything in the country related to intelligence and national security is classified as top secret. On the other hand, everyone wants to speak about what they've done. Acts that people in other countries might be ashamed to admit to are instead a source of pride for Israelis, because they are collectively perceived as imperatives of national security necessary to protect threatened Israeli lives, if not the very existence of the embattled state. After a time, the Mossad did manage to block access to some of my sources, in most cases only after they had already spoken to me. Many more have died since I met them, most of natural causes. Thus, the first-hand accounts that these men and women have given for this book, men and women who've witnessed and participated in significant historic events, are in fact the only ones that exist outside of the vaults of the defense establishment's secret archives. Occasionally, they are the only ones that exist at all. Prologue. Meir Dagan, chief of Israeli Mossad, legendary spy and assassin, walked into the room leaning on his cane. He'd been using it ever since he was wounded by a mine laid in Palestinian terrorists he was fighting in the Gaza Strip as a young special ops officer in the 1970s. Dagan, who knew a thing or two about the power of myths and symbols, was careful not to deny the rumors that there was a blade concealed in the cane, which he could bear with a push of a button. Dagan was a short man, so dark-skinned that people were always surprised to hear that he was from Polish origins, and he had a pot belly with a presence of its own. On this occasion, he was wearing a simple, open-necked shirt, light black pants, and black shoes, and it looked as if he had not paid any special attention to his appearance. There was something about him that expressed a direct, terse, self-confident, and quiet, sometimes menacing charisma. The conference room that Dagan entered that afternoon on January 8, 2011 was in the Mossad Academy, north of Tel Aviv. For the first time ever, the head of the espionage agency was meeting with journalists in the heart of one of Israel's most closely guarded and secret installations. Dagan had no love for the media. This is him speaking. I've reached the conclusion that it is an insatiable monster, he would tell me later, so there is no point in managing a relationship with it. Nevertheless, 3 days before the meeting, I and a number of other correspondents had received a confidential invitation. I was surprised. For an entire decade, I had been leveling some harsh criticism at the Mossad, and in particular at Dagan, making him very angry. The Mossad did everything it could to give the affair a cloak and dagger atmosphere. We were told to come to the parking lot of Cinema City, a movie theater complex not far from Mossad HQ, and to leave everything in our cars except notebooks and writing implements. You will be carefully searched, and we want to avoid any unpleasantness, our escorts told us. From there, we were driven in a bus with dark-tinted windows to the Mossad headquarters complex. We passed through a number of electric gates and electric signs, warning those entering that what was permitted and what forbidden inside the perimeter. Read poorly. Then came a thorough scanning with metal detectors to make sure we hadn't brought any video or audio equipment. We entered the conference room and Dagan came in with a few minutes after us, walking around and shaking hands. When he got to me, he gripped my hand for a moment and said with a smile, "You really are some kind of bandit." Then he sat down. He was flanked by the spokesman of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the chief military censor, a female brigadier general. The Mossad is a unit of the Mossad is a unit of the Prime Minister's office, and under national law, reporting on any of its activities is subject to censorship. Both of these officials believed that Dagan had called the meeting merely to bid a formal farewell to the people who had covered his tenure, and that he would say nothing substantive. They were wrong. The surprise was evident on the face of the Prime Minister's spokesman, whose eyes got wider and wider as Dagan continued speaking. "There are advantages to having a back injury," Dagan said, opening his address. "You get a doctor's certificate confirming that you're not spineless." Very quickly, we realized that this was no mere wisecrack, as Dagan launched into a vehement attack on the Prime Minister of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, Dagan claimed, was behaving irresponsibly, and for his own egotistical reasons, leading the country into disaster. "That someone is elected does not mean that he is smart," was one of his jibes. This was the last day of Dagan's term at the Mossad as the Mossad's director. Netanyahu was showing him the door, and Dagan, whose life dream had been to hold the position of Israel's top spy, was not going to stand by with folded arms. The acute crisis of confidence between the two men had flared up around two issues, and both of them were intimately connected to Meir Dagan's weapon of choice, assassination. 8 years earlier, Ariel Sharon had appointed Dagan to the Mossad post and put him in charge of disrupting the Iranian nuclear weapons project. Both men saw as an existential threat to Israel. Dagan acted in a number of ways to fulfill his task. The most difficult way, but also the most effective, Dagan believed, was to identify Iran's key nuclear and missile scientists, locate them, and kill them. The Mossad pinpointed 15 such targets, of whom it eliminated 6, mostly when they were on their way to work in the morning by means of bombs with short time fuses attached to their cars by motorcyclists. In addition, a general of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who was in charge of the missile project, was blown up in his headquarters together with 17 of his men. These operations and many others initiated by the Mossad, some in collaboration with the United States, were all successful, but Netanyahu and his defense minister, Ehud Barak, had begun to feel that their utility was declining. They decided that clandestine measures could no longer effectively delay the Iranian nuclear project, and that only a massive aerial bombardment of the Iranians' nuclear facilities would successfully halt their progress towards acquiring such weapons. Dagan strongly opposed the idea. Indeed, it flew in the face of everything he believed in, that open warfare should be waged only when the sword is on our throat, or as a last resort, in situations in which there was no other choice. Everything else could and should be handled through clandestine means. Assassinations, he said, have an effect on morale, as well as a practical effect. I don't think there were many who could have replaced Napoleon, or a president like Roosevelt, or a prime minister like Churchill. The personal aspect certainly plays a role. It's true that anyone can be replaced, but there's a difference in between the replacement with guts and some lifeless character. I'm going to go ahead and end it there and continue on the prologue of Rise and Kill First on the next recording. Briefly, I was supposed to be doing Mitchell Heisman's suicide note, but there was some stuff going on with my YouTube comments and other shit going on in the MGTOW community that made me want to do this one instead. It's going to be a real one. And I'm still, as soon as I'm done with this, going to get back to the Heisman stuff, because I truly believe that's more important, but this is a little more time pressing. To be continued in the next recording.